All right. Well, I appreciate everybody coming on this semi-rainy Saturday morning. My name is Paul Kirchoff. I actually live in Austin. So for those of you that are not from Austin, I would like to thank you for making the trip and welcome to the South. Hopefully you'll feel a little bit of hospitality, but meet a lot of interesting people. I'm going to say a few words. This panel is probably one of the most important topics that never gets spoken about. There's a lot of social impact that's going on throughout the world, but if it doesn't trickle down to the people at the base of the pyramid, nothing's ever going to happen. It doesn't matter what level of celebrity you have or whatever. So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to my brothers and sisters from SDG Media Zone and the organizations that surround them, and certainly SAP for giving us a little venue to talk about. As I mentioned, this panel is about exploring what it takes to actually move humanity to take action, to solve its own problems, and to make change happen. And if you think about it, it's not just humanity, it's the human species. And that word, species, is actually the one thing that ties us all together. And so, as you enjoy South by Southwest and you walk down 6th Street or whatnot, you're going to see people that are from every walk of life, every corner of the human species. You're going to see people that have different skin color, different religions, different countries. They have different values. They also have, different education backgrounds, salary, income, houses, boats, cars, and everything else that makes, humans what we are. And within that difference is our diversity, and diversity is what makes us so great. But division within that diversity is actually the thing that may be our ruin if we don't come together. When you look at other species like ants or bees, every individual in that species is geared towards saving and ensuring the ongoingness of that colony or that group. And every single individual is at work to ensure that species survives. And it's arguable that humankind doesn't necessarily think that we're at risk. But the truth is we are. And I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen an ant or a bee move out of the line or jump out of the colony and sit in the corner because it didn't feel it counted or it had lost hope. So there's something that we can learn from even the simplest species that are out there. And for those of you that don't, for those of you that may or may not understand exactly what I'm saying, I'll put it in super simple terms. And this is really the reality of the situation we're in. If you have a fish bowl and you put 6 fish in there and you say to them, we want for you to live in harmony. They have plenty of nutrients in the water to eat. They have plenty of space to separate. They can come together when they want to. But if 2 of those fish fall in love, the 6 fish go to 100, and the 100 go to 1,000, the 1,000 go to 10,000, and eventually you have to put 100,000 people in that same fish bowl. And what's going to happen? Some of them are not going to survive. Some of them are going to get together and cordon off a section of that water, and the harmony is going to be lost. And we are no doubt in a fishbowl. So you have to ask yourself, why for humanity is such a large portion of our population losing hope or feeling that they don't count? And, the people that come to South by Southwest usually have some kind of social impact consciousness. So I'm not really talking to the people that are in this room because everybody here is doing something outstanding about it. But if you actually go talk to a fellow global citizen who is worried about the bottom part of Maslow's needs, like food, air, and water, saving the rainforest, saving sharks, saving fellow refugees from, human rights violations is not at the top of their list. And so as a species, we are failing ourselves to some degree. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because if humanity itself doesn't feel that we are at risk, then nothing's going to happen. And the only thing that I can say for sure will happen is that the history and the story of humankind will be written in one of the layers of rock in the Grand Canyon where I grew up. But the good news is that there are some people that are at least starting to move the needle. And so I just want to start with myself, since we're in this line, and give you some background. So the best way to understand who I am is to know that my parents were very poor. I grew up very middle class. I have a little bit more comfort and resources than my parents had. I'm also half Mexican and half German. And 23andMe just told me that neither of those, despite my life, are the number one piece. The number one piece of DNA in my life is Native Mexican Indian. That's the number one, believe it or not. So the beautiful thing about that combination of economic status and race is that nobody has an excuse when I talk to them about not caring or being put down to such a degree that you can't make a difference. And so throughout my life of software and marketing, which has been my career, I ended up here on this stage with a software platform I spent 2 years building called DominoOne. And it is a crowdsourcing platform for the base of the pyramid to get together, identify the things we need to prioritize, solve it ourselves, and then go fund and make it happen. And so despite all the celebrities I've met in social impact or whatever, their awareness building, which I'm in awe of, stops if the base of the pyramid, the people that are single moms with 5 kids in Nicaragua, or a person that has lost hope in Sudan, it doesn't matter. If they don't believe it, nothing's going to happen. So I've got one piece of the puzzle, but it's just that. So I want to introduce these other superstars. This is Niyanta Spelman, who is with the Rainforest Partnership Organization, doing amazing things to make sure that we keep breathing clean air, amongst other things. So if you want to introduce yourself and tell them what you're doing, that'd be great.
Of course. Thank you so much, Paul, and all of you here. It's always amazing to be in the midst of South by Southwest. Chaos out there, and then you sort of find a little bit of calm. And this is great because we get to share with people everywhere else around the world. That's where we're at now, right? The world has changed in terms of how connected we are. So as Paul said, I'm Niyanta Spelman, and I am the CEO of Rainforest Partnership. And so I'll talk just about that for a second. What Rainforest Partnership is, it's an organization focused on protecting tropical rainforests. But the way we do this is by working directly with rainforest communities, helping them make that income that allows them to protect their forest and their way of life. And as you can imagine, that embodies quite a few of the SDGs right in that one set of work that we do. If you talk about life on land, you talk about economic development, education, climate action. Each one of our projects, income generating source that we focus on, actually encompasses quite a few of those SDGs. The reason we do it that way is because if you think about it, it's the people who live in the forest have the stake in protecting it more than anybody else. But as you were saying, most people don't have an alternative. How can they make a choice when the very thing they have to think about is, what are they going to eat today? How are the kids going to go to school? What is going to happen to them day to day? But if they have an alternative, making a basic income that can help them withstand the powerful interests that come right at their doorstep that want to cut down the forest, whether it is, and I'll have to just go and say it, it's the fact, oil interests or timber interests or cattle industry, cattle ranching industry, all the threats to the forests. Unless they have an alternative, it's not easy for folks to make the choice that would compel them to do what's right for humanity. It has to align with what they need on a day-to-day basis. So that's basically what we do, is help communities have an alternative, sustainable income source that allows them to protect the forest. Because when they're doing it for themselves and all of us everywhere. And that's climate action on our behalf. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later and who I am. These days, Paul talked a little bit about who he is. I was born in East Africa, in Tanzania. Most of you look at me and think, okay, I look Indian, yes. My grandparents all came from India. I have lived in England for many years, and then I've lived in the US for over 30 years, and I work in the Amazon. About as global a citizen as you can get. And that's who we are. As a people, we're connected. WhatsApp connects us all over the world with these folks. So when you talk about how does humanity come together to solve some of our biggest challenges, I think there are all sorts of ways we can do it now, because we're connected.
Well, we're going to talk about several of those. So Amit, why don't you go next?
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you, Paul, for having me. This is incredible. Very happy to be here and share. So I lead the Silicon Valley Blockchain Society, which is the largest institutional capital network in the decentralized space. But we're very focused on this principle of funding the revolution. And for us, the revolution is not just a financial revolution. The revolution is being able to create a society which is actually by the people, of the people, for the people. We've heard that before somewhere. It's written in our Constitution, and yet that is not what democracy has panned out to be. Part of this journey for me came from a transformative process over the last 5 years. My background has been deep tech. Grew up in India as a kid, and then Australia after that. My formative years were over there. Started a company, got acquired by in the end of the dot-com boom, moved to California. I've lived in San Francisco for 19 years since, done a bunch of things successfully and failed. And part of this journey for me over the last 5 years was about, how do I use my financial resources, my, whatever levels of influence, access and network to essentially move humanity forward. And you can encapsulate that within the 17 SDGs as a way to, describe more succinctly what moving humanity forward means. And part of that movement for me has been about applying the companies that I'm involved in. So I'm the chairman of an AI company called Xero. We're deeply focused on a future of responsible AI. And what does that mean? Thinking about issues beyond the normal Hollywood narrative of AI. You talk to people outside our confirmation bias world that we live in, and you ask them about AI, their first response tends to be anything that you've referenced from one of the 8 or 9 movies that have been most popular about AI. And then some of them will refer to Elon's prophecy of how AI is an existential risk to humanity. And I look at it much like you would look at nuclear weapons. Yes, they exist. Yes, they're an existential risk to humanity. And yet, we still care about food safety and traffic safety and environment safety and everything to do with our daily lives. And we take things like privacy in the world of AI for granted. We live in a time where all the devices we're carrying right now are listening, right? And they're transmitting to this cloud somewhere to be processed. And even if we make the naive assumption that somehow there are good actors who are doing this, which is naive because you've already seen what happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, you realize that we still live in a relatively non-authoritarian country here, but there are other parts of the world where you can say negative things about leaders and it would lead to persecution or prosecution or even execution, right? We are dealing with a time where data, people say, is the new oil, and I actually disagree. I think data is the new nuclear fuel because its cognitive abilities allow you to do exponential things with it. And yet we're handing over data to 7 or 8 of the largest companies in the world constantly. I call them GAFA-BAT: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, right? And then eventually, a little bit to what you referred to, there's a lot of different factors in the world that are going to lead, especially because of AI, to losing 40, 50% of the jobs that we know today. And we can take scarcity-based approaches to how we try and deal with this, try and slow AI down, pass regulation, rules, how you're going to regulate something that is so global. You have to use an abundance-based model. And so thinking about how we're going to bring economic sustainability to people around the world in this AI-powered universe we're living in is core to some of the work that I've been doing. And finally, I learned this lesson a couple of years ago that when we sit here in this group, resonating in very similar ways, working on incredible things together, we often forget that we're 1% of the world's population, if that. And we need to find a way to get to 99% of the world's population, right? And not just in terms of how do we get to them with solutions. It's about how do we get to them with the right narrative. because most of the time, this is very easy. We're all resonating in very similar ways. We can talk about the issues of the world. We can talk about the 17 SDGs, and it's easy to do. But narrative really matters. And I was in Davos last month, and one of the things I reminded a bunch of incredible people sitting in a room talking about how they can solve the world's biggest problems is that we're all patting ourselves on the back because of the great work we do. And you can imagine for a whole bunch of other people, the majority of the world, it's a bunch of wealthy people who think they know better, sitting in this beautiful, in the Swiss mountains, trying to solve problems for them, right? And so thinking about how we get that narrative out, I always tell the companies that we bring in, whether into the investment activities I do in AI or with Silicon Valley Blockchain Society, tell me your message for my 70-year-old mother in India. Don't tell me the message for me. I don't matter. And the realization in that for me was a couple of years ago, I started getting involved with the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is one of the largest pure refugee-only agencies in the world. They have, for example, in the camps around Syria, they have about 4.5 million refugees. And I was sitting with the Secretary General, and he said, guess what our biggest need is for these camps? And your natural reaction is to go down Maslow's needs, right? And he said, well, we've got much of that covered. Our biggest need is identity. Who are these 4.5 million people? Even if they walked in with a torn passport, you don't recognize the issuer anymore. And if you don't have identity, you don't have anything. And the realization for me was, we tend to think of ways to get involved in very binary terms. Either you have the funds or access to them, or you're someone like Niyanta who's going to go to the Amazon and run these projects. And the truth is, we have so much we can offer in between. My ability to go and say, you could argue about everything about crypto and the blockchain. It's hard to argue that identity and provenance is the most fundamental use case of why you would use the blockchain. And realizing that we can start helping at scale without ever having to deploy $1 of capital or go and run a project suddenly allows us to, bring in so many more people into this battle without imposing narrative or without letting them know that we have all the answers. And so that's a big part of my approach to what we're doing.
Well, that's why you're here. We have one person fixing stuff in the Amazon and Ecuador and everywhere else. We had another one bringing technology that will help amplify, and capital, by the way. And so we're going to move on to Brock here. Brock is a epic filmmaker. People may have heard of the first film, Sharkwater. New one just came out, Sharkwater Extinction. And they just won a prized award for it. But it's an amazing story that he has, and just another block of amazingness in this group here. So go ahead, Brock.
Thanks, Paul. Well, as Paul says, my name's Brock, and I'm actually a shark in a human suit. So whilst I hail from Los Angeles, I live in the ocean. And I'm a cinematic activist, so our job is to tell stories and to empower people to find purpose out in the world. And in our chosen field, I work with Team Sharkwater, and we have a nonprofit organization called the Sea Change Agency. And our job is to make sure that people are enlightened to the fact that, love them or hate them, sharks are necessary on this planet. That's our chosen totem because, they've gotten a bad PR rap over the course of time. In Jaws and in everything else that has come out about sharks in the mainstream media, they're portrayed as these black-eyed villains that want to come and eat you, where nothing could be more far from the truth. The truth of the matter is that sharks are beautiful and sophisticated creatures and extremely necessary for the health of the ecosystem in the ocean. They take care of all the trophic cascade and all the species beneath them. So, we do our best to make sure that people can have the truth about sharks and maybe fall in love with them and want to protect them as much as we do. And we highly believe in the power of film to get out there and use this message and story to inspire and empower folks. So we're hopeful that we can continue to push that stone forward.
Yeah, it's an incredible movie. If you haven't seen it, I think it's on iTunes, right?
Yep, just came out on iTunes a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I dare you to watch it and not shed tears for humans and sharks in this thing. It's really well done. So kudos to the 4 years it took or so to make that happen.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and as you see it, you'll see it's a bumpy road. And whilst we're dealing with a lot of interesting drama and issues in the ocean, there's also a tremendous human component in that whilst making this film, we lost our hero and our narrator and my best friend, Rob Stewart. He was a courageous and a great voice for sharks throughout the world, and he really was a great spokesperson for changing the perception on what was happening in the oceans. And it was a tragedy to lose him, but the silver lining in this entire thing is that his message is amplified, and many people have picked up his torch and want to carry this message forward, and it's been a beautiful thing to witness.
Awesome. All right, well, I appreciate you guys. I wanted to say one thing, because as I'm hearing your stories, and maybe you feel the same way, I can't tell whether this is an age-related thing, which I should say experience, not age. But you know, the more I've done in life, and whether I'm meeting billionaires or celebrities or whatever, I find respect in those relationships, but I find inspiration from stories like yours. And I think that one thing is common amongst the friends that I have ended up with is that we're all so far past the cars and boats and, you know, what you sold your company for and who's a billionaire. Who cares? I mean, I could care less. I think the thing that is most amazing are people that are selflessly pushing the edge for human benefit. I mean, because that is a noble cause. And so I just want to take a second to recognize, you know, the three of you for what you're doing and what you're bringing to this. But the one thing that's common in this, other than the human species, is that, you know, we're all talking about the other people. You know, I mean, nothing against, you know, all my brothers and sisters that go to Davos, because there's some great, powerful relationships that come out of that. But I didn't go to that specifically because I would rather spend time on the 70-year-old, you know, grandmother and everything else. I mean, how do we get these people to change? And so that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time, you know, talking about. And the reason I shared my background in the way that I did is because I'm just an average person in this global citizenship that just decided to go do something about it. There's nothing special about me that is not from anybody who might be on the other side of this camera. But when we, one thing that's interesting is this DominoOne platform that has the ability to crowdsource problem solving and empower these individuals. You know, one thing that's interesting is that it cuts across every problem. So with even just these three relationships, I'm learning about how humanity is dealing with Maslow's needs, or selling sharks for shark fins, sometimes brutally, or whether people have human rights or identification in refugee camps, or whether or not people are responsible with the wood that powers the ecosystem around them. And there's some common threads. There's like a common math element to the problem, always, across everything. And, you know, I'm just going to list these things off, and then we're going to dive into whatever time we have. So one of them is economics for the resource owners. Do you know that, like, I think we did some work on trafficking, and it's one of the fastest growing crimes, and part of it is children are being put into some kind of trafficking because the local people in that indigenous, you know, community, wherever it may be, including right here in Austin, Texas, and where I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, is because the people that are using their kids for money is because they can't handle food, air, and water, right? That is higher than their kids' safety. So economics of the resource owners is one thing, and that's something that you're digging deep on. Another one is policymakers. You know, a lot of times, I've been in many conservation conversations, and they say, well, what about the policymakers? You know, we just need to pass new laws. And I keep thinking to myself, again, representing the average person at the bottom, if you want to pass new laws, how about we all withhold our votes? That'll pass new laws, right? I mean, it's not that complicated. We don't have to go raise money to go combat, you know, a giant company. And then there's awareness and understanding, right? Which, Brock, you're deep on. Like, how do we just make people aware that and educated that this is happening, and here's what you have to do? And then there's empowerment, right? How do people feel empowered that they can change things? There's the organization of the ecosystem. We have so many social impact companies that are by themselves, barely paying their bills because they're all fretting for their own fundraising. Well, what if that wasn't the case? What if all the oars were in the water going in one direction? And then there's the investment side. You can't do a lot of this without capital. It's got to come from somewhere. And then there's the culture, right? What if we had a culture where everybody said, you know what, it is completely out of fashion to see you with the plastic straw, right? I mean, that is how all these things have to be present. So, this is a huge challenge. I mean, this is as grand upon grand upon grand challenges other than, me going swimming inside the great storm on Jupiter or something. I mean, this is the next big one. So we're going to dive into each one. So we're going to start with, Niyanta, with you on the economics because you're seeing that real time. So here's the question. What are some examples of the ways that local communities who once exploited these resources because they had to are now solving their own economic challenges, and you're seeing it real time? So how are you getting these people to withstand some better funded private interests?
So what's interesting is, when you ask that question, sometimes they were making that choice to exploit those resources not because they were even thinking whether that was good or not. They just didn't know any better, right? Here's the forest. It's always been here. It's always supported us. And a few hundred years ago, you live somewhere, you get your resources from the forest, and then you move on, and that forest sort of folds back in, and at some point that's not sustainable anymore because you've got too many people, you're staying in one place, you're not moving around like you used to. But also there's more of it being taken out, and we won't even talk about what climate change is doing to the forest. The most important thing in this equation is a choice. Can people have a choice? What we've found and seen in the communities we work with in the Amazon is there are so many communities that are actually looking for a choice and an alternative. And so what we're doing is looking at where are they living, what are the opportunities in the forest they're in, what do they know, what's their culture, and what can we do together, not impose, what can we do together that gives them that alternative? I'll tell you something else. It's not just merely getting the alternative, they're willing to work towards it and wait while we're actually creating these alternative income sources. Wait, because the whole idea of getting hope and knowing that there's another way of doing something, that you don't have to take that forest down. And that's what they want. So when you take these choices to the communities that actually want an alternative, and you say, okay, is it going to be taking fiber from the forest? Are you going to make something as simple as, I didn't wear my earrings, and things out of fiber and seeds that the community may make, or ecotourism. You've gone and visited forests. There's so many things that these forests hold. They're so much more valuable standing than cut down. When they start seeing the value, when we start seeing the value, and there's an alternative, and you start down that path, it changes the dynamic. And then once you're sort of awake, and you started thinking about it, you start making different choices. And we have no idea what the domino effect is over the years and how it affects once one community makes the choice to not cut down their forest and to go make this different choice. It has an effect up and down these rivers, because remember, in the Amazon, your rivers are how you get around. And so I think it's really about, if we're talking about whether it's the forest or anywhere else, everything you've said as well, how do we as humanity create possibilities for folks? And we, the 1%, or actually a fraction of 1% really, have the ability to do that because it's in our best interest as well. And I think...
Yeah, I was going to ask you a follow-on question to this really quick because, humankind is interesting because we have free will, and free will is the basis for, choices which can lead to innovation, but it's also the basis for greed, right? And so when you roll into an indigenous community to give them these alternatives, it seems to me like there's two things you could do to try to get change. You could say, hey, everybody, we're all interconnected, and if you guys don't leave this forest up, folks on the other side of the world are not going to be able to breathe, right? And that's a tough one. But if you say, hey, you have this level of resources, and by doing it this way, you can now acquire more levels of resources. One is playing to the knowledge that interconnectedness matters, and the other one is playing to human greed, not in a bad way necessarily, but in the way where they can provide for themselves, right? And so what's your approach?
You don't even start with the interconnectedness, because when you're in the forest, especially if you're in the deep Amazon, that's all you know. There is nothing beyond. It's like, why are you wanting to do this? Why are you coming here? You mean you don't have forests? Which is why a lot of people take the forest down, because they go on forever, it feels like. They feel like they're a boundless resource, except they're not. And so you can't even go there. But it's that people are seeing what's happening to their forests. Their climate is changing. Deep in the jungle, people will say the climate has gone crazy. There's such a strong connection between tropical rainforests and climate change. There are 15, I won't get into statistics, but really, they make up less than 3% of the surface area of our planet. You just think about that. And we lose more than, they're responsible for more than 15% of carbon emissions every year. They're sitting there as a solution for us as a humankind. A very easy, efficient, far cheaper than converting all our cars to renewable energy. The communities, when they are wanting to make a choice, they're seeing what happens when the forest goes away, or when an oil company's left a trail of damage. They're getting sick. They cannot get fish anymore. They cannot hunt anymore. They cannot live off the forest. They've seen this in their neighboring communities. That's why they want an alternative. And now social media has changed everything. In the jungle, you can sometimes get signal. And people are going to the big towns and getting educated, so they know what's happening. They're getting empowered. So they know they have an alternative, and they want that. And that's the
I think that's amazing. So we have a handful of minutes left. We're going to keep skipping across these things. So you take a couple of minutes on policy, right? Because this is a big one. I mean, laws can sometimes govern, the masses, right, in terms of their ability to be free. So, I guess one thing is, what do you see are ways that the base of the pyramid can apply pressure to policymakers, right? Other than withholding votes, which was my solution.
Well, I think at different levels, we're starting to see this happen already, right? So if you look at let's look at corporate America, right? Greedy corporate America. Do you know, outside of base wage, what is the #1 retention factor in Silicon Valley today? It isn't massages or laundry or all the crap that Google and Facebook threw at everyone, right? It's what the companies stand for, what their moral fiber is, and how do they stand by it in actions. And you're starting to see that a lot now with Google's pledge of do no evil, right? It's such a rubbish pledge to ever have. If the best thing you can stand for is to do no evil, you don't deserve to be around, right? What do you actually stand for, right? And the number of people who are leaving these companies and going and either starting their own companies or joining impact startups or impact companies because they care about what they do is incredible. So I think we're starting to see this at different levels. You're also starting to see, I'll just take 20 seconds to quickly talk about, you look at the crypto space. We've all heard about it. We've looked at, how crazy it's been, and, Bitcoin was at 19,000 and, all of that. But the reality is, if you go back to the roots weren't in Bitcoin or a white paper that someone named or pseudonym Satoshi wrote. You look at the oldest developers in this space by amount of time spent. They're from Russia, the Ukraine, Argentina, Venezuela. And what's common across those regions? Authoritarian regimes, you can't control your economy because the currency controls the economy. Hyperinflation, same thing. Collapsing currencies, same thing, right? People were driven to start getting involved themselves. And these are all signalers. I'm very optimistic about what's happening with the fishbowl that you describe, because I think at all levels, we're starting to see that level of participation. And then you also have, to me, there's both the carrot and the stick. You know what the largest investment category is today, not by volume, but just purely by number of people? It's impact. It's not AI. It's not blockchain. Now, yes, the numbers aren't high because, for example, in 2017, 2018, Impact VCs deployed about $280 million into Impact, while at the same time, mainstream capital was about $85 billion. So the difference is really, really massive. But the number of people who want to invest their values now is incredible, right? And then you have the other side, the stick. You know, for those of you who don't like the idea of the tax argument, you may not like this. But to policy, in 2013, the government of India passed a law, it's called the Section 135 Act, that requires all companies with a 3-year average net profit in excess of $132 million to spend 2% of that on CSR. CSR, ESG, sustainability, impact, call it what you may, right? It came into effect in 2017. In that first year, in the city of Pune, which is about 1/6 the size, economic size of Mumbai, which is where I grew up in Pune, that unlocked about $258 million of CSR capital, the exact same amount that Impact VCs in North America spent in 2017.